Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome back to another mini-sode. So it's going to be the last in our series. If you've liked this, we'd love to bring more hot topics to you in the next season at the new year. So feel free to send us questions unanswered, looming thoughts, new ideas. Love to feature those and answer any of your hot topic questions. The subject of today's conversation is around bias and performance reviews, which is so timely this time of year, as many people are anticipating those, going to be doing those year end or maybe at the beginning of the calendar year. Or if your organization does them on a rolling basis, even better. That's actually a good inclusive behavior. But nonetheless, working within the systems we have, it's important to know that performance reviews, like many elements of the employee experience, are rooted in bias. And if you're not addressing bias, you're not an inclusive leader. So we have some ideas on how to protect, especially marginalized employees, women, people of color, those from underrepresented groups, are often likely to face systemic biases. And when you're thinking about systemic biases, here are some specific ones to look out for. And this comes from the work from Joan C. Williams, her latest book, Bias Interrupters. She actually has survey data she's collected over decades, over 14,000 participants, pieces of data, where she's surveyed people on the perceptions of bias and where it is in the workplace. And she found, I thought a really key, interesting stat from her book was white men typically judge the workplace as fair, like 20 percentage points higher than women, and especially women of color. So if the workplace isn't necessarily so fair for everybody, why isn't it? Where do you look out for biases, especially within the context of your performance reviews? Because that's one, shining light on the employee experience. So one of the key biases she points to is the tightrope. And if you think about it with gender, this happens across the dimensions of diversity. But if you think about it within the context of gender, for women, you're labeled as too aggressive, or we're not expressing enough confidence. Like you have to be somewhere in the middle, like just right. Like I remember the feedback at a performance review, I was too pleasing. And then in the next performance review, I was too confident. I'm like, I don't know how to be both of these things. Like, what do you all want from me? Women are more likely to get feedback on their personality, not actual behavior too. So just make sure you're not expecting different things for different groups, as we often give performative feedback based on personalities to underrepresented groups. So the tightrope, watch out for that one. Prove it again bias, watch out for this one as well. Underrepresented groups are often overtasked with not just having to do the thing once, but to prove themselves multiple times to be viewed as just as capable of that majority group. So what I used to hear when I was overlooked for a promotion or skipped over in a performance review is like, he's a go-getter, he'll figure it out. Oh, yeah, he's never done it before, but surely he'll know how to do it, is what I heard. And then about me, it was, I don't know. She did it once, but could she do it again? She's never led a team like this before. It's AKA, I've never seen someone like her lead before. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. This happens again, over indexes with people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus folks, the list goes on. Third area of bias to look out for is the tug of war. And sometimes this is called, with context of women, called the queen bee syndrome, where underrepresented folks are actually pitted against each other because there's this perception of a zero-sum game. There's only so much room for one of us or two of us. I remember this happening in a leadership rotational program early in my career, and my female boss at the time said there's another woman joining. At the time I was the only woman. Are you going to be okay with that? Sometimes women fight each other. And so she planted that bias in me. We didn't fight at all. It's a social construct. This is not a natural behavior that women have or people of color have. It's just this concept of being the only or one of the few really disrupts hierarchy and it creates tokenism. So watch out for that tug of war. And then the maternal wall, which this is more for caregivers. So not just women, but caregivers as a whole, even women that don't have children, and those that are primary caregivers, which, about a third of folks in the United States don't identify as female that are caregiving. It's important to know this is a cross-gender experience, and even for folks that are not the primary caregivers or are not in caregiving roles at all. So how this works is because we perceive women as caregivers, we tend to give less promotions to primary caregivers, fewer pay increases, and the opposite is true oftentimes for men when they become fathers. So watch out for the maternal wall, biggest source of bias affecting women in the workplace, and why progress for women in leadership is stagnant at best. Other biases, affinity bias, we like people like us. So when you're doing a performance review with someone you like, make sure you're not unfairly giving them a nudge up. Make sure that there is criteria in place that's objective. So one thing that you can do to slow bias down is to ask yourself, how do I know this true? What evidence do I have? How could I objectively have objective criteria to evaluate this person's performance? And if you're struggling with feedback from someone else or something internal to you, use one of my favorite tools, Kristen Pressner's Flip It to Test It tool. The next time someone says something, problematic or biased, or you yourself have that thought, ask, would I say the same thing if the person were a different gender, race, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation? If not, probably a problem with bias. If yes, then maybe you're bias-free. Inclusive leaders also give candid feedback and stretch assignments equitably across underrepresented groups who are more likely to give those stretch challenging assignments to men, to white people, to folks with all of their abilities, because we trust that model more, because we have seen that more leaders overrepresented that identify with those identities. So make sure you're being equitable with providing feedback and challenging assignments, because that's how people grow. That's how they get better. That's how they learn. That's how they develop. We need to be equitable with feedback and challenging assignments. And then, when you think about the systems of performance reviews, a couple key things: objective criteria, right? Make sure that goals can be objectively measured and have objective data. Calibration sessions, make sure you get different perspectives. One of my favorite things to do is just making sure when we evaluate somebody that we all weigh in and use an objective rating scale, again, on key competencies, key behaviors, if they're more subjective. But again, back to objective, did they hit the results? And what results did they achieve? And how would I objectively measure those? So lots of ideas to unpack here. Know the sources of bias. Performance reviews are one key element of the employee experience, and oftentimes a telling one for diverse talent and if they stay or not. Is my behavior, is my performance being recognized? Is it being rewarded at the same rate? If I were someone different, of a different identity, would I be judged differently? People don't stay places where they're not treated fairly, where they're not respected, where their performance isn't valued, and they don't feel purpose in the work they do. So just remind yourself, before you blame diverse talent for leaving the organization, what are you doing to address biases, especially in how you evaluate performance? So thanks, listeners, for following us along on these hot topics. I'll link to the full article. This was based off an entrepreneur article I wrote earlier this year. Send me more of your hot topics. You can get in touch with me over at nextpivotpoint.com.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program, or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.